Malaysia is one of the richest economies in Southeast Asia as measured by its gross domestic product per capita. Here's a graph with data that we collected from the World Bank on this matter. As you can see, Malaysia's GDP per capita stands at $11,648 for the year 2023. Comparatively, as you can already see in the graph right here, Malaysia's GDP per capita has always been much higher than most major Southeast Asian economies, except of course Brunei and Singapore. This is true even if we use the GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, PPP, where Malaysia in 2023 has over $37,247, far above all other Southeast Asian economies, except again Singapore and Brunei. So, does this imply that Malaysia is a rich country, at least compared to its Southeast Asian counterparts? Well, everything today is opinionated. Some people don't believe that Malaysia is a successful economy, as many believe that it is plagued with corruption, government mismanagement, and high debt levels. But the data says otherwise. Malaysia is an outstanding performer, not just in Southeast Asia, but in many parts of the world. Yes, we often like to compare Malaysia or any other Asian developing nations out there to the likes of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. But we fail to see that, even though Malaysia is not as rich as these nations, it still has been able to outperform relative to its regional counterparts. As a matter of fact, if we use the GDP per capita, PPP metric, Malaysia isn't actually that far behind compared to these Asian tigers. Let's add South Korea and Japan to this data set. You can see that Malaysia is trailing behind, but not that much. It might even be possible to say that Malaysia might catch Japan one day. After all, if we take a look at the GDP per capita annual growth and compare it to Japan, we get to see this. From 2010 to 2023, as data published by the World Bank, Malaysia's growth has been outperforming Japan, except on two occasions, in 2020 and 2021. But you might ask, why use the GDP PPP metric rather than the normal nominal GDP one? Well, the reason is simple. GDP PPP adjusts for the cost of living and differences in prices between countries. This means it gives a clearer picture of how much people in a country can actually buy with their money. For example, while Japan's nominal GDP per capita is much higher than Malaysia's, the cost of living in Japan is also significantly higher. In Malaysia, goods and services tend to be cheaper, so people can get more for their money even with a lower nominal income. This brings us to an important point. Economic success is not just about having a high GDP per capita in nominal terms. It's about how that wealth translates into the quality of life for people. Malaysia has managed to achieve impressive results in this area. Its middle-income population enjoys relatively affordable healthcare, education, and housing compared to many developed nations. This affordability, combined with sustained economic growth, has allowed Malaysia to improve living standards for a significant portion of its citizens. Moreover, it is also important to appreciate that Malaysia has not always been this close to the Asian tigers, nor were they this far from other Southeast Asian economies. There was a point in time where the GDP per capita of Malaysia was close to its neighbouring countries, and where its GDP per capita was much, much lower than Japan. Here's a graph with data published by the Madison Project Database 2023, where the data is expressed in international dollars at 2011 prices. This data is also adjusted for inflation and for differences in the cost of living between countries. As you can see, Malaysia's GDP per capita in 2022, according to this dataset, is $26,629, whereas Japan is $38,269. But if we go back in time and see where Malaysia had been lagging behind, we see a far different picture than where it is today. As you can see in the graph, 1973, 1984, and 1997 are years where Japan had been outperforming compared to Malaysia. Even in 1991, Japan's GDP per capita was over $30,838, whereas Malaysia's was only $8,781. But as years went by, Malaysia's GDP per capita has nearly reached that of Japan in 2022. The same story applies to its neighbouring countries. Here's the comparative graph with the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. You can see that just after the Second World War in the 1950s, Malaysia's GDP per capita wasn't that far ahead compared to its neighbouring countries. As a matter of fact, at one point, the Philippines was even ahead in 1958 and 1959. But if we extend this graph to later years, we get to see a completely different picture. These three major Southeast Asian economies are nowhere near the per capita levels of Malaysia. This again showcases that while Malaysia is not an outperformer globally, it is an outperformer in the region where it lives in. Therefore, comparatively to its region, it is rich, but by global standards, it is slowly getting there. One of the most debated topics in Malaysia's economic success is corruption. Corruption has plagued Malaysia for decades. We have seen some of the biggest corruption cases in the entire world to happen in Malaysia. Just remember the 1MDB scandal, which brought global attention to Malaysia for all the wrong reasons. The One Malaysia Development Berhad scandal involved billions of dollars being misused, implicating high-ranking officials and even former Prime Minister Najib Razak. These scandals then led many to believe that Malaysia is a corrupt country. But while corruption exists, it is actually far less than most Asian economies. Here's a table with the rankings coming from transparency.org on the Corruption Perception Index by country in 2023. This data is based on expert analysis and surveys measuring perceived levels of public sector corruption in various countries. As seen on the table, Malaysia has a score of 50 out of 100. Having 100 means that a country is perceived to be completely free of corruption, while a score of 0 indicates extremely high corruption levels. With Malaysia scoring 50, it falls into the category of moderately clean countries. This is much better than, for instance, China itself, which has a score of just 42, or Thailand with a score of 35. As a matter of fact, there are only a select few countries in the entire Southeast and East Asian region that have a score higher than Malaysia, and are the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore. This should then again put Malaysia to be in a relatively better position than most major neighbouring economies out there. Now, another debated topic in Malaysia is the country's national debt. Many love to blame the government for incurring high amounts of government debt. Here's a graph with data that we gathered from the International Monetary Fund on the gross debt to GDP. As you can see, Malaysia's gross debt position as a percentage of GDP is over 68.38% in 2024. But while it may seem high, it's actually not super high as compared to its close neighbours. For instance, the Philippines, if we add it to the graph, and Thailand, we see that both nations nearly have similar gross debt to GDP as Malaysia. It is only Indonesia and Vietnam that outperforms amongst the major Southeast Asian economies. As a matter of fact, even China and India have higher debt to GDP levels than that of Malaysia, even though Malaysia has a higher GDP per capita than India, and is closely similar to that of China. Finally, one of the most important indicators out there to see just how competent a country's government is through their inflation. Why is inflation an important indicator, you ask? Well, inflation reflects how well a government manages its economy, particularly its monetary and fiscal policies. high inflation erodes the purchasing power of citizens, making daily necessities more expensive and potentially leading to social unrest. On the other hand, low and stable inflation indicates a government's ability to maintain economic stability and safeguard the well-being of its people. In Malaysia, inflation has actually been performing well. Here's a graph with data from the World Bank on that matter. You can see that from 2000 to 2023, Malaysia's inflation has ranged from a negative 1.1% to as much as 5.4%. But those two data points are outliers. Most of Malaysia's inflation has been around 2 to 3%, which is the ideal range for a healthy economy. However, it is quite difficult to compare Malaysia's inflation rate to other countries, as there are just too many factors influencing one's inflation rate. Nevertheless, as you can already see, their inflation rate has been in the ideal range, and as long as it sits here, it just shows how well run Malaysia's government is, particularly for the factors we mentioned earlier: monetary and fiscal policies. Monetary is basically how the central bank, like Bank Negara Malaysia, manages the economy by controlling the supply of money and interest rates. Fiscal policies, on the other hand, are about how the government collects and spends money. For example, Malaysia has used subsidies for fuel and food to keep prices stable during global crises. These subsidies help to reduce the impact of rising prices on consumers, especially during tough times like the COVID-19 pandemic or the 2022 energy crisis. In both instances, as reflected by the inflation data, Malaysia has been performing well. Now, of course, this video doesn't really go out and tell you that they are doing extremely well. They are still behind the Asian tigers, but it should at least show you that Malaysia has been doing well compared to many, many economies out there. We just compared Southeast and East Asia to Malaysia. But if you take a larger picture, Malaysia is actually performing much better than a number of countries globally, ranging from South Asia to South America, and even a select few countries in East Europe. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.